want to make sure we have enough time to take your questions, so let's reconvene. Okay. So I want to go back to our theme of revival and reform and remind us of the fact that, look, we are looking at a lot of these complicated changes that are taking place in Islamic societies. There are people, folks conquering, right, and people responding to that. There's Sunni, the Shiite century, and Sunni revival, and so on and so forth. It's a complicated history. But, and it's not always easy to pinpoint and say that this was the revivalist of the century. You have a number of people who are working, who are seeking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who are seeking to bring some part of the lost aspect of the deen back to life, right? And so we see Imam al-Ghazali, for example, wants to bring the spirituality back. He wants to bring Iman back. He wants to bring intellectual certitude of Allah back to people. Ibn Taymiyyah wants to bring back the initial energy and unity of the Ummah and its emphasis on the Quran and the Sunnah. You have people like Shah Waliullah who are involved in bringing the sciences of Hadith, but also they want to bring back what is good in Tasawwuf and Falsafa and so on. Ahmad Sirhandi, for example, who wants to turn Sufism into a movement for the Sunnah, right? So he wants to use the social organization that Sufism has created, which is social networks around the Muslim world, and he wants to use that to bring the love for the Prophet ﷺ and the focus on the Prophet's Sunnah back. So you have a lot of complicated things going on, and we also see that none of the reformers is perfect. None of them is above criticism. Somebody writes something, they contribute tremendous knowledge and tremendous energy and iman to the ummah, and somebody else comes and takes some of the good things that they do and then also critique them in some of the things that they failed to do. So this is the history of revival and reform in short. There are no easy answers historically to who is always right, which group always wins, right? The best thing that comes out is the interaction. When Muslims do Amr al-Ma'ruf and Nahi al-Munkar to each other, they remind each other of what you are missing. And remember, I find that the example of Abu Hanifa and Malik and Shafi'i to be a really great characteristic example of how revival and reform works in Islam. Because you have two groups that are emphasizing and bringing out two different aspects. The people of Kufa are focusing on reasoning and more speculative reasoning. The people of Medina are focusing more on athar, collecting traditions, so that they keep the traditions of the way the Prophet ﷺ lived. Imam Shafi'i comes and takes what's good in both, and then all of the other schools take from Shafi'i the mixture, the synthesis that he has created. So in some ways I could actually say, as I do in my book on Ibn Taymiyyah, that Ibn Taymiyyah does actually the same thing, even though people today do not see it that way. But Ibn Taymiyyah actually builds on the writings of Ghazali and Razi in a very profound way. But he doesn't reject either Sufism or Ghazali or Razi completely, even though the contemporary advocates of all sides make claims that are not entirely credible or at times even honest. So with this general statement, I want to go back and touch on a few more things pertaining to revival. Now, this mic doesn't allow me to move around very much, so I'm just going to set it aside because I got to move. Okay. I want to go back a couple slides and make a few points. One of the interesting things that one notes is that number of women scholars begin to sharply decline in somewhere around 16th century. All right, so there is a great book by Sheikh Akram Nadwi, who is at Oxford right now. He edited a 14-volume work of women scholars, muhaddithat, women scholars of hadith from the beginning of Islam and every century. And what he finds is that there are many hundreds of scholars, of women scholars in every century, and then all of a sudden around, I think he says 16th century, when the number of women scholars declines sharply. Why that happens, I don't fully know. That one needs research. But my explanation, one of the things that is happening perhaps is that the value of knowledge is declining perhaps for its own sake. Because when women learn something without having immediate job prospects, women are learning hadith and teaching hadith, hundreds and hundreds of women scholars, that means they're learning hadith and Quran for its own sake. Not because they don't get any jobs. In fact, their families support them. But when we move toward a different kind of economy perhaps, and certainly in post-colonial period, although this seems to happen even before then, and that I'm not sure why, but when one moves to a job-oriented economy, knowledge is all primarily professional. And knowledge is learned in order to get a job to make money. Nobody's learning because that knowledge is sacred or holy, not because that knowledge is worthy in itself. It's a goal of life. When we move to that kind of economy and that kind of society, the number of women scholars and the number of, and perhaps generally the quality of scholarship suffers. Another thing that I find that perhaps I should point out is Shah Waliullah, the 18th century scholar that we talked about. His comments on Sufism are quite revealing, that tells us something about the mindset of Muslims of the period. This is 18th century India. And Shah Waliullah, remember, is himself a Sufi and a philosopher and a muhaddith and a faqih. Like he knows, he's a master and he's a master jurist, not of actually both Hanafi and Shafi'i madhabs. And his assessment was that Sufism was a path that was essentially different from the path of the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, let's look at how he thought about it. During the time of the Messenger of God, upon him be peace, and his companions, even many generations later, people were primarily concerned with the commands of the Sharia. Other things, that is feeling and sentiments, were associated with the carrying out of those commands. Their ihsan was prayer, that is salah, fasting, dhikr, that is mentioning of Allah, reading the Quran, hajj, charity, and jihad. None of them ever spent an hour in meditation or tafakkur, or thought of a pure presence of God isolated from dhikr and other things, or tried to attain it. Okay? The best of them got pleasure in communion or munajat, praying with God, in salah and in dhikr. None of them emitted a cry, went into ecstasy, behaved abnormally, or uttered shath. None of them new theophany or tajalli, that these are all the terms that of course Sufis talk about, or his hiding, istitar, and things like that. They loved paradise and feared hell. Disclosures, that is divine disclosures or kashf, and miracles, ecstasies, and trances are hardly reported of them. And if any of these things occurred to them, it was accidental, never intended or deliberately cultivated. The conviction, yaqeen, which they had was the living consciousness of things in which they had faith. It was like the vision or the insight, firasa, which men ordinarily have. But these were not things that the commoners could not have access to. In time of Al-Junayd, intense exercises or ascetic exercises, meditation and remembrance, which led them to states, ahwal, there were unveiled to them the secrets of tajalli, theophany, or God's appearance, or istitar, God's veiling, through kashf. They could know the states of others' hearts. They abjured this worldly life and lived in isolation. They ate grass and leaves and wore patches. They learned the ways of deception of the nafs and the devil. The hallmark of this phase was that they did not worship in hope for paradise or fear of hell, but only for God's love. Okay. In the third phase, that is the 5th or 11th century, the elite of the elite, khas al-khawas, reached the state of absorption, jadb. It was unveiled to them that there is only one being, that sustains all things. They became lost in it, their selves colored in its color, such that they no longer needed any litanies, ascetic training, or spiritual exercises. In this age, Tawheed Shuhudi, oneness of witnessing, and Tawheed Wujudi, oneness of being, were not differentiated. Their focus was to erase their selves, not investigations of the reality of all things. Okay, after that came the age of Shaykh Akbar Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi, and a little before, 6th century, in which their minds further expanded and they sought to go beyond states and ecstasy and investigate the true realities of things, such as the descent of the necessary being and the nature and process of the first emanation. These are all Neoplatonic terms that he's using. So this is Shah Waliullah. All right? So what is he doing? What is he saying? Does it make sense? What is he saying?
Just to follow the first freedom of Islam, the Sahabis and the practical rules of the Prophet.
Well, he's not saying that though, right? What he's saying is that the Prophet and the Sahaba did not practice Sufism. But he's not saying that Sufism is bad, right? What he's saying is that all of these that came late, things that came later, he's not saying they're bad. He's saying they all have their place, but the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba would not have liked, he says, what Sufis do, which doesn't mean Sufis are wrong. Does it make sense?
No. But he's kind of implying that Sufism is wrong.
Excuse me, sorry?
He's implying that Sufism is wrong, right?
He's implying that. Actually, he's not implying that. You might think that. But he himself is a Sufi, and he's not implying. Remember, what he's talking about, their minds further expanded. He's not saying that they are wrong. He's saying their minds are expanding. Yeah?
You just explained the gradual transformation of Sufism. He didn't actually take a stand saying it's good or bad. He just explained that what happened in the 1st century, the 2nd century, the 3rd century.
Well, yes. So in this, he's not taking a stand, but we know his stand is that all of these things are actually correct in their own place. Yeah.
I think he's also pointing to the distancing of people from the actual state that's demanded by religion.
See, that we are all reading that into it, but that's not what he's saying. He is not saying that this later development is bad. He's just saying it's different from Sharia. Sharia is just one of the many paths. Yeah.
So I guess basically he's just saying that we made Islam more complicated or difficult where it didn't have to be.
Well, he is not saying that. He's perfectly happy with it. He thinks there are just many ways of looking at the truth, and Sharia is one of them. Yeah.
I think what he is saying, the earlier Sahabas, they just say the Salah, Jama'at, Zakah, charity and all of that. So they are following the command of the God, but they are not seeing the presence of God, like Sufism is what he is trying to say, right?
Right.
So saying, rather than just following the command and see the God is here, but try to feel it from your inside, that God is really present in front of you and He is seeing whatever you are doing.
Not exactly. Back there.
So, we in one of the hadiths that once the Prophet comes to the mosque and sees two groups of people, one making zikr and one seeking knowledge, and he goes to the group. Is that hadith, like, I read about the hadith, but I don't know if that's authentic hadith. And
Can we finish this first? Yes.
He used to pray all the night,
Right.
all alone.
Right.
And other Sahaba
Yeah.
also used. Isn't this meditation? What
No, that's what he's saying. You see, that's what it's. I'm just trying to challenge your minds to think like how they actually thought, right? Scholars of an 18th century Sufi, who was also a muhaddith, his understanding of the truth is very complicated. The idea that everything is judged by what the Prophet ﷺ did, and that's the only way, that idea Ghazali had, Ibn Taymiyyah had, right? But that's not what Shah Waliullah has. And what I'm trying to say is that in the late 18th century, in India where he's writing, Sufism is greater than Sharia. When Ghazali was writing 5 centuries ago, Sharia was the standard and Sufism needed to be brought in. When he is writing in a different place, far away from the center, Sufism and various versions of Sufism are far more popular than Sharia. So he has no problem saying that Sharia is just one path and Sufism is a different path. Is he right about it? I'm not going to decide that for you, right? I just wanted to show that there is a little challenge I wanted to throw to you so that you don't think there is a simple story to be told here. Yes?
But if he is talking about what the Prophet ﷺ did, which is different from what people then were doing, then he's just, for lack of better words, he's just nicely putting it out there, right?
Nicely putting it out there?
Like, he's trying to be diplomatic.
So he's diplomatically saying that Sufism is not is not good?
I think so.
Okay. You would think that because today we take it for granted that the Sharia is a path to God. Right? And the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba were the highest authorities. He doesn't seem to think that.
Exactly. This is more of a pluralistic approach. There are different.
That's a what I call a synthetic approach, where he's saying that Sufism. Look, he's saying I have no problem telling you that Sufism is a different path. As a historian, as a muhaddith, he knows that the Sahaba never did any shatahat. The Sahaba or the Prophet never talked about I have a tajalli or a communion with God, or I have, I have this wilaya, or I can walk on water, or I have, all of these states that Sufis talk about. Nobody ever talked about it. As a muhaddith, he knows it very well. But still, he's not rejecting any of it. He's saying this is just, our brains are getting more and more complicated.
So in summary, in one sentence, he was comparing how the Prophet ﷺ's time and the companions got to know God versus the Islamic history, how they decided to get
versus this version, right? Now the remain people of Sharia, of ulama, would have never accepted anything but the Sharia, right? But what he's trying to do is that he wants to say that there are these different paths, that he is acknowledging they are different. Now Imam al-Ghazali was not willing to acknowledge the difference because he wants to bring it in. But he's acknowledging that they are different.
But I think, if I'm not miscontextualizing, he said one of the lines that through their kashf or unveiling they can read the state of people's heart. That's where I see.
Yes, yes. So these are all the claims that Sufis have made historically, right? But he's saying, as a muhaddith, he knows Sahaba or the Prophet, they don't really, I mean, the Sahaba never made that claim. Yes?
Other contemporary scholars rebuke him for this?
See, that's the interesting part. Indian scholars, after Shah Waliullah, they set aside the problematic aspects or the things that are difficult to explain, and they take only the parts that are easy and that are good, if you will. So, for example, nobody actually talks about these parts of Shah Waliullah. And what I'm trying to show you is that how Muslims deal with difficulties. Okay? Like, for example, Ibn Rushd. You have somebody like Ibn Rushd who wrote philosophy in which he has some very interesting Aristotelian ideas that are very difficult for Muslims to accept. Everybody reads his book Bidayatul Mujtahid wa Nihayatul Muqtasid. He's a great Maliki jurist. He wrote falsafa that was out of, you know, the norm, and just people ignore it. They take what's good. Leave the rest to God. But anyway, another thing that I want to point out is that other Sufis and other scholars of the time are rejecting this approach, and they're saying there is one epistemology and one path, and this is either right or this is wrong. And but he's trying to. He's the last great synthesist. He's the last scholar who is trying to bring Neoplatonism and Sharia and a number of other understandings and keep them all together. Yeah.
But the Ahlul Hadith would have spoken against it, in the sense that
well, he was a muhaddith, but yes, Ahlul Hadith would not have accepted it. Yes. Well, I guess at this point in time, I will just have to take questions until I guess we wrap it up. I don't know how much time we have.
I'll set that 5:30 and it's 4:35.
Okay, about an hour. Okay. Yes, sister.
I was really looking forward to hearing about Maududi.
Okay. We'll talk about Maududi. Yes.
So from your reading, what do you think was the mainstream Islam being taught at the madrasas, right? Like we were seeing that somewhere around after the Abbasid period, the institution started growing, right? And you were talking about the waqf, spending money on madrasas and hospitals and all that. So what was the mainstream being taught? Was it a combination of everything, or the people of Kalam were actually having an upper hand?
Well, different madrasas were teaching different things, but usually the curriculum would include, would focus on a fiqh of whatever fiqh that people happen to be belong to, and then there were specialized schools for falsafa, and Kalam was part of the curriculum if you were in any of the if you were a Ash'ari or Maturidi in the East. Okay.
You mentioned about the second wave of spread, right? Spread of Islam. So was that primarily attributed to Sufism or?
The second wave of Islam, was it attributed to Sufism? I don't honestly know. I think we need more research to say that. But yes, there is some influence of Sufism, but then traders played also a very large role. So it seems like Muslims just spread, and wherever they established, they brought Islam with them. Yeah.
Would you call Sir Sayyid Ahmed Khan to be like an apologist for Muslims? Because some of his ideas seem to be like...
Well, yes. When we enter modernity, and that's why it's difficult to talk about the modern period in the next 20 minutes because I have only 20 minutes left. But so I wouldn't say that these are revivalists, right? These are major figures that are trying to struggle with the conditions of their time. So Sayyid Ahmed Khan is somebody who is living in British India, and he wants Muslims to become modernized, and he wants Muslims to be rational. But what is interesting is that completely new standards of rationality are being imported. And so he wants Muslims to be rational along those lines. So for example, he considers, because again he has sympathy or sensibilities with Hinduism that shares with Hinduism, so he is, for instance, against sacrifice on Eid al-Adha because that seems to be an irrational thing, right? So in every age, new things, different things look irrational. For Muhammad Abdu, for example, in Egypt, he denies jinn that are, posited in the Quran, a different being that is jinn. But these people he begins to call them some psychological or some kind of forces, I don't remember exactly. But modern Muslims, when they face modernity, they're trying to understand Islam in modern Western terms, in trying to prove that it's scientific and rational and humanistic and so on and so forth. But those are all new considerations. People before modernity, before colonialism, had completely different set of concerns. Right? You had a lot of movement and revival and reform and critique, but along different lines. Okay, well, let me take a minute to then talk about the contemporary Islamic movements in the 14th century or the 20th century. So, the 20th century opens with most Muslim countries colonized by either the British, the French, or the Dutch. And in India, the British lasted for very long. They came the earliest because India was one of the richest empires. And so Muslims in India encountered modernity before most others. The next region was Egypt, which was controlled because of the passage to India. So India and so Muslims in Egypt also got, if you will, penetrated first by the French and then the British for quite long, but not nearly as long as India. So what's interesting is that revival in the modern form comes from regions that are most penetrated by colonizers, because the people now need to reformulate Islam in terms that will be meaningful in the new context. And what's the new context? The old society in this century and a half, the old society is destroyed and systematically, if you will, dismantled. The education system, the institutions, the legal system, the economic structures, all are dismantled and replaced by modern structures, either by the colonizers or Muslim rulers who are trying to modernize so that they won't be taken over and run over by the colonizers. So in this, by 20th century, by the end of the First World War, even the last hope of Muslims, if you will, of unity, the Ottoman Empire breaks down, and if it is officially, if you will, ended, the Khilafah ends in 1924. Muslims in India, who were not, of course, part of the Ottoman Khilafah, but when they felt threatened, they realized how important the Khilafah was for them. So one of the first movements to save the Khilafah, and one of the most widespread, actually comes from India. That is, Indian Muslims are trying to pressure their British colonizers, don't dismantle the Ottoman Empire. Which doesn't happen, of course, and the British do, and so on. So now, after the Caliphate ends, it's a symbolic end of all of the structures, the kind of society that existed before. Now Muslims are almost left with nothing. Like you have to start from scratch. In this period, you have Banna and Qutb in Egypt, and Iqbal and Maududi are considered famous, of course, important, influential scholars in South Asia. They're all trying to deal with this new reality. And the new reality is colonizers have destroyed the old Muslim world. Almost nothing other than, of course, people have worship, people have their prayers, people have their relationships, but all the political and larger structures have been destroyed. Islamic law has been replaced, for the most part, with modern, either Napoleonic law in Egypt and British common law in South Asia, except the small sphere of family law. Everything else is replaced. So people have to begin to think about how to live in this new context of a modern nation state. Something new hits Muslims, and Muslims didn't know what to do with it. And that thing is the modern nation state. A new structure, a completely, a new way of thinking about politics, in which rather than society, it is a state governed by leaders who's supposed to represent all of this nation and this territory, and they are supposed to organize a powerful military that is streamlined with a powerful economy and bureaucracy, which is served by a powerful economy. All of these things are what made Europe the power that it was. And Muslims wanted to change as little as possible, but every time they tried to cheat and say, okay, let's just change the military and nothing else, they lost. So by this time, First World War is over. Most of the Middle East is divided between the British and the French. India or South Asia is a British colony. So this is a time when you begin to, people begin to, for the first time, ask very big questions about how do you bring Islam back? How do you live Islam in this completely new world in which the structures that lived for about 1,000 years have gone away? So Maududi is one of the first major thinkers who begins to think in terms of the modern situation, the modern nation state. At first, actually, he rejects the nation state. At first, he says there is no need, for example, when there is a demand for Pakistan, he doesn't, or separation of India and Pakistan, he actually, and Pakistan as a separate state of Muslims, he doesn't accept it. Muhammad Iqbal, on the other hand, a Muslim philosopher and a great poet, he has embraced nation state already. Even though he doesn't like nationalism, he has embraced the idea of the nation state, and he proposes that Muslims in India can live in peace only if they make up their own nation state. Later that became Pakistan. Maududi is somebody who doesn't think that a nation state is, or nationalism is an Islamic idea. That in fact he believes that it's an idol. It's an ideology that is going to compete with Islam. But there is very little that you can actually do. The whole world is moving in the direction of nationalism and nation states. And Maududi himself, when Pakistan is actually established, moves to Pakistan and begins to theorize of how to make Pakistan an Islamic state. That's where the idea of an Islamic state is born. Which is not to say that Muslim politics did not exist before, or that Islamic government didn't exist before. But he wants to take this new beast that nobody fully understands, the state, and he wants to make it Islamic. And that is a project that proves much more difficult than initially thought, because nation state itself has features that may make it very difficult, if not inherently incompatible with the Sharia as we historically know it. Why is that? We'll give you quick reasons. Sharia has been from the beginning a bottom-up law. It's a law elaborated freely by the ulama, right? And believed by the people. And people who don't believe in Sharia are minorities or dhimmis. But they're not, the law is not imposed on them. Whereas the modern nation state requires that the law of the land is created by and imposed by and interpreted by the state. Now the state may or may not be democratic, but even if it's not democratic, the law belongs to the state. And so that's, if you will, the theoretical difficulty that the ulama of this period have. Now most ulama of India and South Asia, generally India and Pakistan, do not really perceive the problem. Just like in some ways Saeed Ramadan al-Bouti of Syria, who died supporting Bashar, because he said, essentially, he lived and fought in the medieval world, at least according to my interpretation. So he saw Bashar as simply another medieval ruler. He did not see that what had come in the modern nation state is a completely new beast. It was the powers of the modern state in shaping lives and ideologies of the people are so much greater that they are not comparable to the Islamic, to governments or the sultans or sultanates that Muslims had before. So what Islamists saw, right? Islamists are people, a new crop of people that emerges in the Muslim world. Who are the Islamists? Well, Islamists are people who are trained or who go to school in the schools that are established by either colonial or post-colonial Muslim states. But the way of education is essentially modern Western and secular education, whose main purpose is to make you good secular citizens, or at least good useful clerks, which is very different from pre-modern education. These people who grow up reading English or French and with different sensibilities, and this is also mass education, unlike before where education was limited to a few people because they didn't have printing press and so on. So education was very different, and most of the education took place in your family. People did what their father did and so on and so forth. So this was a new world. You know, there are millions of people who are now attending these new kinds of schools, and the books that they read are mostly Western or Western inspired. All of them are created in order to inspire progress. Progress is understood strictly as becoming more like the West. Progress is understood in a way that Muslims never understood progress before. Progress, according to Muslims, there was no such thing. There is no word for progress that is you find in 17th or 18th century. There is good life, there is justice, you know, there is better government, good government, bad government. But you don't have such thing as progress. Now everybody wants to make progress. Everybody wants to serve the nation and the religion. And religion here is understood not as people had understood before, but religion is somehow understood as the religion of the nation. So if you're from Pakistan, Islam and Pakistan go together. One can't imagine that Islam would go in a different direction than Pakistan. In a very similar way as in America, God always blesses America. Right? God can never dislike America. There is only one God that's available, and that God is always blessing America. If one goes up and says, I think God does not like America, right? That person would be smoked the same moment. Right? But if God likes America, even an atheist president could say God loves America. So that's nationalism. It's a very different understanding of religion than what people had before, where it was deen and sharia that provided the basis for life, and governments came and went. Right? Here you have government that is organizing people's life, and religion is adopted as if it's a choice. It's a very new mechanism. For example, if you look at constitutions of Muslim countries, there is this idea that people of Pakistan or people of Egypt or people of Jordan or this are there. They exist before. There is such a thing as a people of Pakistan. And these people are adopting Islam either as one or many sources of law. So even if it's an Islamic state, there is such a thing as state. There is a person. State is a person who can be a Muslim or non-Muslim. Now this idea would have absolutely driven any pre-modern scholar crazy. What do you mean this state is Muslim? Pakistan is a Muslim state. What are you talking about? Pakistan is not a person. It is what? There are people who live there who are part of the ummah, some Muslims, some not. Right? There are laws that they rule by. These are laws either given by Sharia or not. But what is this Egypt? What is Egypt? How can Egypt convert to Islam? Right? How does that happen? So this new idea is born that state is such a thing as it's a personality, and it converts to, it is Muslim, an Islamic state. And nobody really knows what that means. So these things are very complicated questions that have not yet been settled. And that's one of the a serious concern for modern Muslims. Right? And these are things that we and our children have to go back to the Quran and Sunnah and Islamic history for and try to find answers to. All right? How much time do I have?
5 o'clock.
2 minutes, okay. Questions? Okay, sister back there.
Islamic history and summary Islamic history comprised.
There is one book that, unfortunately there isn't one book that does so, but if you write your name on the list that is being circulated, I hope. Is there a list that's being circulated?
Yes.
Okay, so if you write your email, I'll make sure that you get these slides that I have sent and also a reading list. Inshallah. Yes, brother, back there. Tabligh Jama'ah. Tabligh Jama'ah was actually in some ways a very organic reaction of Muslim society. It has nothing to do with the state. Right? So in some ways it's actually a pretty good phenomenon. If whatever the content of it, I'm not going to comment on, but in terms of the mechanism, it works beyond and above or below the level of the state. Right? Which is perhaps in some ways it's a very good thing. Yes?
It's kind of a two-part question. So you mentioned about the nation states and probably that's a challenge that the future generation has. But even the notion of nation states as such is challenged due to the advent of internet and like this whole globalization that's going on. So Europe is pretty much consolidated.
Yeah.
So do you think we still need to work on solving the nation state challenge, or do we need to
it's not as easy as it sounds. I mean, even Europe tried, European Union, and they're having a lot of trouble because people, I think Muslims have a lot more to go on. Muslims have the possibility of doing a lot more than the European Union, right? But of course there remains the doctrine that for Muslims, in some ways Muslim society was always more global and always was able to think above or be above the nation state or above these boundaries. So in some ways Islamic society is more capable of dealing with globalization than the nation states, because it always knows how to work above and below the nation state, right? Yes?
So you mentioned that early on, in the pre-modern era, the Muslim society was able to better absorb the change of rulers and their infighting, and one party takes over and the other, and they were not as perturbed. So what happened with the modern colonialism that they were not able to absorb it or counter it as effectively?
Well, because it was of a scale that was completely unprecedented, and all of the institutions which earlier rulers did not dismantle were, with colonizers, were completely systematically dismantled for the reasons that have to do with modernity. I mean, if we understand modernity, which will be a completely different workshop.
Divide and rule.
It's not just divide and rule. Fundamentally, modernity challenged all of religion and all of understanding and all of society in a very fundamental way. Yes?
Okay, so I guess maybe from a historian perspective, for the next 10 years, I guess, or for this decade, what would you say are the priorities for us Muslims, not as an ummah, but for instance, just American Muslims, with the challenges, that we have, such as, like the stuff that ICNA, for instance, is addressing, like the anti-Sharia bills, the challenges we have in the media, the Muslim civil rights issues.
The biggest enemy of truth is not persecution. It is apathy. When Muslims are persecuted in a sad but true way, it's good for Iman if they can respond in the right way. So I don't think that we should worry too much and be depressed about what the media is saying. I also think that Americans are people that don't really trust anything very much. They're not their media, not their government, because they're used to being told lies. They know what their media is selling. The media is always selling something. The Americans are used to, in fact, lying and presenting themselves. But they know that all of this is just presentation. There's a great book, by the way, by a Princeton philosopher, if you're interested, called On Bullshit. Which is what he says, this is how it sums up the American culture. But anyway, to go back to the serious point, is that this means that Americans remain very open to actual, genuine human interaction. Because all of these things that Fox News and others tell them, unless they are part of a very strong church and network, these things are very easy to move on. So that's why I think that personal relationships, da'wah, teaching, or even more importantly, I think, or equally importantly, beginning to articulate Islamic mission in terms that ordinary Americans can understand without compromising. That is a great challenge, I think, that Muslims have not overcome. In other words, I want to be able to dream as a Muslim that I want to change the world, and I want to be able to share that without scaring people off. Right? And that is possible when we begin to talk the language of, I think, environmental disaster, economic inequalities, the problems that modernity has caused in the world, the problem that, of course, American forces are causing around the world. These are things that most Americans are aware of, and you can find resources within Islam, in Islamic history, in the Quran and the Sunnah, to address these things. And when you do that, I think it's much easier to make bridges and to talk to younger American generation. They're very ready for it.
Okay.
So we actually been waiting on site.
Okay.
There's a Azat right now.
Oh,
so
okay. Okay.
a couple of comments from Brother Saad and we wrap it up.
Okay. Well, first of all, Jazakallah khair to Dr. Ovamir for coming over here. It's been a long weekend. And second, I'd like to thank you all for coming on behalf of MCA as well as the Islamic Learning Foundation, which is a project of ICNA, about which Brother Amin mentioned earlier. If you have not signed up, so there is a sheet in the back. Please do sign up. We will be sending out electronic versions of these slides onto those emails. So make sure you do sign up. And once again, Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.
प्रोग्राम की
मैं कह सकता है कि एक आयोजन का प्रोग्राम है
I think it's just process. I think that they may have failed in their stated goals, but they have succeeded in their unstated goals.